So we're going to move now into these pairs of conversations. The one person who's been a key member of our initiating group over the last 18 months is Ruth Holgate, who unfortunately, because of other commitments, is unable to be with us tonight. Originally, she and I were going to be in conversation in the first of these three conversations. In her place, Ron Smith is going to take the form of a sort of interviewer of me, because Ron hasn't been part of the initial conversations, but she's very much here tonight. I can't see you on my screen, Ron, but if you could raise your hand, that would help, and we could kind of find you.
I am here, Nick, don't worry.
I see you now. Great to see you, Ron.
Don't panic.
And at this stage, I think the members of the group who've got their hands raised can unraise their hands, or whatever the term is on the screen. Ron and I, we've got a few minutes to talk on the first aspect of this mission of the forum to support and resource spiritual directors. So, Ron, I'm in your hands.
Very, very dangerous, Nick, very dangerous. Yep. So, I mean, I think firstly, obviously, support and resource spiritual directors, but perhaps expand on that, the purpose of that a little bit for us.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which surely it says what it does on the tin, or does what it says on the tin. But I think the sense is that to create opportunities for both spiritual directors and spiritual directors networks to find a greater support for each other in this ministry. So that sense of support, mutual support, is key, I think, and very much part of what motivated me to be seeking this. But also that sense that as networks and individuals, we may have all sorts of resources that are valuable and helpful to this ministry. How do we share them is kind of one of the questions that's worth asking, I find. And so the forum, it seems, can provide a way in which we can more easily share some of the resources that may be held individually or in networks, or even nationally. I mean, at the moment, the Retreat Association has the guidelines for spiritual direction available on its website, but that's kind of one of the places that maybe sits within the sense of resourcing that we are seeking.
So, I mean, you're kind of mentioning resourcing, and I'm guessing that implies if we're sharing them, then there's needs around, that we have a variety of needs. So I'm just wondering, what are you seeing as some of those needs?
Well, it's been striking as people fed back about the whole idea of the forum to hear that sense that people had of the value of having connection, of having a conversation with other people who are involved in this ministry. Some of those conversations happen in networks and so on, but the sense of, certainly over lockdown particularly, every gathering of people involved in spiritual direction has kind of been resounding with this sense of, isn't it great to be able to talk with each other? And you know, the gift of Zoom in all of that has been part of it. But that sense that somehow we've missed something, and seeing the possibility now, I think, is very strong. I think, you know, spiritual direction is by its nature quite isolated. We do what we do in a room with one other generally, and we leave that and we're on our own again. And so this sense of the valuing of connection, I think, is something that has emerged. Yes, the regions provide some networking for people. but I've picked up quite a lot that there are a number who are outside of that. I mean, I'm just spotting on the chat, Alison saying, "Are you in Scotland? We'd love to have a conversation." And that sense of the value of connecting. For some people, you know, access to networks is quite hard, and before Zoom, it was probably even harder for many. I mean, Zoom doesn't take away some of the problems, but the sense that we can and do need some bigger conversations, I think, is there. And I think the other dimension to this is the national scene, really. There are things that are really good for spiritual directors to have a big conversation around. I mean, just over a year ago, we had the terrible news coming in of Jean Vanier and how some of his directees had been abused by him. And how do we have a proper conversation in the world of spiritual direction in this country around the issues that raises? How do we handle safeguarding? And how do we find a collective voice that can speak into that sort of controversy and saying, well, this is what we seek to do, and these are the safeguards we seek to work with? There was kind of an ignorance of that in some of the conversation on that debate, which I was saddened by. These are all parts of where I see some need, I think, that is there.
Yeah. So some critical conversations and support, and that we need to be able to have. So, I mean, I guess the next question is, well, how might this happen?
Well, yeah, and we're seeing it in action, I think. You know, the fact that we can gather a large number of spiritual directors together, that common interest, I think, you know, the Zoom provides a forum for doing this in a way that we perhaps 18 months ago hadn't even thought of as a potential for this forum idea that we were playing with at that point. But that's not to say we're dismissing the possibility of real physical gatherings at conferences or forums in a place where we're all in the same room together. That would be wonderful too. So we envisage that. But both those methods can give that sense of conversation, of support, of the mutual discernment that is part of this process that we're in, I think. But I think also, you know, again, the internet is providing us with an incredibly powerful way of sharing resources. We can get emails out to everyone you know, with relatively little effort. In fact, I speak from experience, having sent most of the emails that have gone out to the forum over the last year or so. But then, of course, there's also social media and web pages, and I see the web pages providing us with an opportunity to put lists of resources, links to groups, you know, just the place for people to come to find something that might be helpful for them.
So kind of the finding something that's helpful. I mean, where are those resources going to come from that we're going to be sharing? I mean, that's the good question.
Yeah, I look at that and think, whoa, are we set a big agenda for ourselves? But I think some of those resources are already there. It's not that we're going to reinvent the wheel in all of this. I think it's more to some degree collecting the wisdom that is where some of those resources already lie and are available, but perhaps not as visible or not as commonly known about as a forum could do that. You know, the Retreat Association guidelines I've already mentioned would be one resource present, but there are many resources held in the local networks across the country which we might be able to kind of point to as well and be offered wider. But I think there's also the need for more resources to be generated. And that's part of what we envisage some of these working groups doing, is beavering away to produce some helpful resources or find resources and add them to the list. So there's a potential for quite a lot of work here, I think.
Okay, so in true accompaniment form, I'm aware we're coming up to time. So, so in a nutshell, then, what are you hoping for?
Well, Chris earlier used that sense of the common table and that mutuality that is both open to or seeks to be supportive, offer valuable resources, inspiring better practice in us all, I think is a huge thing, actually, and very exciting to me at this point. But the other thing I'm really hoping for is more people involved in enabling all this resourcing and the communication and supporting, because we're only a small group at the moment. It needs to be bigger in terms of active engagement. So something about more people to share in that process.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you, Ron. Great questions. So that first element to do with support and resource. The second element that we're going to move on to now is the promoting and protecting of good practice. And in this, John Francis and Alison McTeer, John Francis Friendship and Alison McTeer are going to be sharing. Over to you two.
Thanks, Nick. I'm from the London Centre for Spiritual Direction, Alison from the Retreat Association. So we're going to have a conversation much as Ron and Nick did. So Alison, I wonder if I can first ask you, what examples do you find that there are of good practice in spiritual direction?
Well, I suppose coming from the Retreat Association, I'm bound to give reference to the guidelines. Nick's already touched on them, and obviously they're only one part of the greater whole, but they were put together in a very collaborative way, which I think is also very much underpinning the way that this forum has drawn together, and were in response to a training consultation for those who train spiritual directors, and took place over 3 years to draw them together. And so I feel that's been something that perhaps we can build on. I mean, for example, at the London Centre, you have some guidelines as well, I believe. And what kind of model do they follow?
Yeah, we do have guidelines. The reason we put them together was very much a sensed need or a felt need that was gradually growing, that we need to be able to offer some principles to people, not rules, but principles that those who associate themselves with the centre particularly might be aided by in their ministry. I'd previously been with, Edinburgh is here from Chelmsford, but I used to be part of the Chelmsford Diocesan core group or area core group, and we created a similar. I imagine a lot of places have something similar, but probably we're all slightly different as well.
Yes, and I think that's the beauty of having sort of guidelines that can be amended or adapted to region, but we're all essentially coming from the same place. We're all wanting to share good practice and kind of update that according to events and needs.
Absolutely, but in all of that, of course, I might not know what insights you have, and I might be aided by those insights if I knew what they were, and similarly the other way around. Mm-hmm. So my sense has always been that a forum is an ideal place, and probably the only place where that kind of conversation can happen. And why reinvent the wheel if Area X has done a lot of work, let's say, on safeguarding?
Yes, I agree.
Why do it all over again and possibly come up with something slightly different and missing something? So my sense has always been that one of the reasons for the forum is to come up with these examples of good practice that we can share with one another and learn from each other as well, and see where maybe we've missed something.
Yes, I agree. I think this is living guidelines that are going to be changed all the time, and that we need to make everybody aware of as much as possible. And the forum is a very good platform for doing that.
Absolutely. I mean, I like the term guidelines. I think that that's sufficiently kind of flexible, so it's not a rule, but
Absolutely.
promoting good guidelines.
So I wondered, John, if you think there are what your views would be on areas that perhaps we could look into, some areas of good practice that have not been covered so much, in which there might be a need to have some kind of guidelines.
Yes, well, I mean, I think particularly that area of safeguarding. I know a number of regions have developed and are offering some sort of training in safeguarding. But I know, for example, when we started looking at this from the London Centre, people were saying, oh, of course, my area has safeguarding for clergy. And that's very true, but I went through all of that. And I know that spiritual directors have a very specific need to understand what safeguarding means in the terms of the ministry. We're not running Sunday schools. Well, probably anyway. So what are our particular needs, for example, that safeguarding needs to cover and acknowledge? That sort of thing is really, really important. Similarly, in the area of supervision, I know there are very mixed views on the need for supervision or the purpose of supervision or what actually it is. So just having conversations about what do we mean by, understand by, where can we find it, and who maybe can we encourage to develop that particular ministry of supervision.
Absolutely. And I also wondered about the whole practice of working on Zoom and on screen, which of course a couple of years ago there probably wouldn't have been the need for it, but now it's just so overwhelming. And it seems to me that it is changing the dimension of how we practice spiritual direction, and is an area that people are very happy to have guidelines or to have discussion about, and that might be very pertinent at the moment.
I think that business about a place of discussion is really quite important, because as Nick said originally, this is a very, I'm not going to say lonely ministry, but one that's often in solitary places. You might be fortunate to belong to an area group that gathers from time to time, but that area might be very scattered, and you might not be able to meet very often, if at all.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think Nick has also highlighted the value of gathering for people who are working in more isolation.
Yeah. So that really sort of leads me on to wondering, how could this forum help then, do you think, Alison?
Well, I think we can continue to invite discussion and development in the way that we've already started to do by holding this event and the previous one, and to find a way of articulating a shared understanding of good practice, so that it really does support the people that are part of this forum, and offers a way to pass on information and good practice as easily as possible.
And presumably to be a place where ideas, suggestions, questions could be processed.
Yes, absolutely.
And received.
Yes. Yes, I think it could be a very lively process, but one that I think everybody would hopefully find great value in.
I'm sure. I must say, I was very surprised when I first started looking at this matter of the possibility of a national forum, that Ireland has a national forum, but Britain doesn't. America has one, but Britain, we're always a bit behind, it seems.
So it'd be really good to make up for that a bit and find a way forward. And I think it'd be really interesting to hear people's suggestions and ideas, both this evening and following, just to see where people are coming from in this, because I think we really need to hear what everybody is thinking and how they're responding. I'm sure a lot of people are already buzzing with some questions and thoughts. So let's pass on to the next pair
Do you have anything else that you wanted to say, Alison?
No, I think that's, I think we've covered the areas now. Thank you.
Okay, so Nick, we'll pass on to the next pair. So there's not too much champing at the bit, and we can eventually move on to that general sharing.
Thanks very much, Chris. Sorry, John Francis and Alison. Next, it's Christopher and Julie about the advocating and encouraging creative development of this ministry. So over to you two.
Thank you and good evening. It's really exciting and wonderful to be together and to be part of this emerging forum. So to advocate and encourage the creative development of this ministry within the church and in the world, those are big, big topics and really suggest so many ways forward, and we'll be very interested to hear what you think on this. And for now, a few thoughts from me and then Christopher. Chris, when we chatted the other day about this, I said something that you thought might be a helpful start. I imagined that our task in this area was like a triangle with 2 points outward and 1 point facing inward. Reaching out on the one hand to the church itself, finding our voice, advocating and promoting spiritual direction and its gift within the wider church. Reaching out on the other hand to a changing world so much in need of fresh, accessible and creative expressions of spiritual direction. But the third point I saw as in reach, and that may seem a strange thing to include at this point, but I think, and we agreed, that the way we think about ourselves is crucial to how well we can reach out. How we advocate and encourage spiritual direction amongst ourselves will influence how we promote it out there. To reach out well, I think we need to be healthy and grounded and strong in our identity, in our charism, knowing what we are and what we are not. I think that means being not merely relevant, which is always seductive, that is, being merely relevant, but not being merely relevant, but radical, which is to say deeply rooted. I think it means not being just merely professional, but prophetic, which is to say, I guess, having fire in our belly for what God wants to say and do in the world. We need to see ourselves as both prophetic ministry and pioneering mission, if you will. There's a lot to unpack there, but I wanted to get that concept of in reach in here as part of the discussion about how we encourage ministry in the church and in the world. Because I think there's a desperate need of a robust and searching spirituality, one that reaches into the church and into the world with prophetic imagination and draws deeply from the wisdom of the tradition. So I'd love to think about how we could encourage that as part of this aspect of our vision. And Chris, going on from there, how do you see that reaching out? Where do we begin?
It's really helpful, Julie, that you've begun with that radical openness to God and to a tradition, and actually knowing where we come from. As maybe we begin to reach out with a more collected voice. I guess that's the idea of a forum, that we have the possibility to be able together to speak in the first instance, perhaps to the church. And we've already said something there about, for example, National Retreat, the Retreat Association guidelines, and Nick mentioned about the whole Jean Vanier scene, and the need there to have a clear voice about what's the vision, what's the values, and what's the value of spiritual direction. So there's something around that. And one of the things I'm conscious of, and certainly came up through the survey, was that many local spiritual direction networks feel under pressure, feel under-resourced. And I wonder if there's something that a forum can offer in that collected voice about underlining the not just the value of spiritual direction, but also its particular values and how important those are for the healthy functioning of the life of the church. I think one thing we were very conscious of was not wanting to undermine, undercut, try and take the place of what was happening locally and regionally, but looking at where collectively perhaps we could have a clearer voice. I mean, another thing I'm aware of is we're in a very strange time of being church at the moment, and very important decisions and discernment hopefully going on about where we go forward as church. And it seems to me that the spiritual direction community has a lot to share, a lot to give to that, because our practice is around discernment, listening, prayer, dialogue, you know, in the spirit of dialogue. And maybe we've got something to offer to the wider church with those skills and practices. An example of that in Roman Catholic Church, there's just the little sneaking idea of synodical working and local synods to begin to touch into local views about where the church is and where the church might be going and responding to the needs of the world. Maybe the spiritual direction community has something to offer to a process like that. How do we discern? How do we listen? How do we make decisions? And as spiritual directors, my sense is often we're rather shy and reticent. And maybe it's a time to be more generous, even more assertive in offering what we have. That's maybe looking at the church. But one of the things that I'm also very aware of, and we've already talked about, is so much is happening in our world, and lockdowns kind of highlighted that. And actually how much spiritual hunger there seems to have been in people who don't go to church necessarily, aren't connected with formal religious frameworks, but looking to have a place to talk about their experience. Is God real? And if so, then what might I do about that? I just wonder, Julie, do you have any reflections on that and the relevance of spiritual direction to that hunger?
Yes, thanks, Chris. It clearly is a very ripe time for promoting spiritual direction in the world, isn't it? People are searching deeply and they're asking really big questions. When I think about promoting spiritual direction in the world, I think of process and content. For process, I ask myself, and then you, how might we do spiritual direction in different ways to reach more people? Online, that's really opened up, hasn't it? In groups, could we do more of that? On the bus, what would it mean to actually begin to imagine spiritual direction as something more than just that very particular conversation one-to-one for an hour behind closed doors? I think we really need to think about this because we need to get out there with what we have. But I think of content as well, and I think that we need to try to communicate when we're promoting spiritual direction the depth and breadth of the spiritual conversation. People searching these days know that it can't be just about a private feel-good spirituality, but must be address the bigger picture. I think we have to offer people the sort of spiritual direction that takes questions like practice and lifestyle very seriously. We need to link up the inner and the outer far more than we do now. It has to be able, spiritual direction, to stand up to the big questions, social injustices and ecological disaster and polarized politics. Something that's become more and more apparent in my own spiritual direction and in my accompaniment of others is that we must do the work. We can't just talk about it anymore. We must do the work. I think that means finding practices and helping people to find practices that nourish our inner life, open our eyes to both the beauty and the pain of the world. And to develop the sort of practices that will compel us to want to change the way we live. So I hope that made sense, that the process is important, but also the content of what we're promoting in the world. So going back to where I began, we need to promote amongst ourselves and then offer to the world nothing less than the radical and prophetic vision of Christ, really. Oh, any final thoughts from you, Chris, on that?
Well, I was just thinking that perhaps in some ways what a forum does, it enables us to have that collective listening place and place of dialogue with what's happening in the world in the same sort of way that we do in individual spiritual accompaniment. You know, we're listening to someone, we're trying desperately to listen to the Spirit, and how am I called to respond to this person's need? And maybe, you know, responding to an individual's need, we go out of our comfort zone of what we normally offer because this person needs something else.
Yeah.
And I think maybe the forum might help us do that collectively as we meet these new challenges, new needs, this hunger. We also are challenged to get out of our comfort zone and respond creatively as we listen to the Spirit.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. It's a very rich area, as are all three of them.